Welcome to Design Domination, where you'll learn to become a better, more business-savvy designer so you can dominate your competition. Hi, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Colleen Grotzer, and in this episode of Design Domination, I'm going to give you 23 of my pro page layout tips for print, digital documents, and the web. Stick around to find out how to polish your page layout skills so that you have more professional-looking and reader-friendly pages. They say the devil is in the details, and the details are part of what can make a good designer even better. These tips apply to print, but also to digital documents and the web. Let's start out with some that are related to composition. Tip number 1 is use a grid. Now, when it comes to print and digital documents, in your page layout software, you can set up a grid on the master or on regular pages. In InDesign, you do this by going to Layout, and then Margins and Columns, or Layout, Create Guides, and set up guides for, say, 3 rows and 3 columns. It could be anything. A colleague of mine likes to use 12. And in Affinity Publisher, you would do this under View and then Guides Manager. For either option, though, you'll want to set a gutter measurement so that you have space between the sections of the grid. So, for instance, you could set up a grid in 3 columns with a 1/4-inch gutter. Body copy could run the width of 2 columns, leaving the outer column for a pull quote or a sidebar. And then images could either be 1, 2, or 3 columns in width, and 1/3 or 2/3 of the page in height, depending on how your grid is set up. And this will ensure all images or sidebars, whatever it may be, will be the same width and height, if you want that too, resulting in a very clean layout that is pleasing to the eye. It also makes it super easy for layout because you never have to go back and get the measurement of an element from page to page. You can just place and drag frame edges to meet the guides. Now, on the web, most themes already use grids as part of their setup, so you don't usually need to worry about it. Tip number 2 is use sufficient inner and outer margins. Ensuring enough space in the inner and outer margins makes text easier to read and really makes something that's text-heavy feel not so overwhelming. And this applies to both page margins and column margins. Now, for print, if you have a publication that will be perfect bound, and it's, say, several hundred pages in length, then you will need larger inner margins called the gutter. And that's so you can accommodate for that. Otherwise, you run the risk of text winding up inside the gutter, which means someone won't be able to read it unless they forcibly hold the book open. Now, if it's a publication that will lay flat, such as one that is spiral bound, and could be of any length in terms of page count, you need a larger inner margin to accommodate for where the spiral or the wire binding will be. Otherwise, you risk text ending up where those holes will be. Not only that, but if you have content centered on the page and you don't take that space into account, then the content will be too far toward the gutter. Now, on the web, most themes have already accommodated for these margins. Tip number 3 is balance page elements. You want to balance out where you place text, images, tables, and sidebars, and so forth, and ensure that there's a main focal point, which can be achieved through scale and color. For print and digital documents, it's good to balance out the left-hand and right-hand pages, called the spreads. You can balance out the content by not having all the photos, charts, or tables all on one page and all of the text on the other, for example. Maybe you place a pull quote on a left-hand page and then an image on a right-hand page. And then instead of running a table at the bottom of the left-hand page to the top of the right-hand page, leaving it where it falls in the text order, put it inside its own frame and have it all together on one page, or run it across the bottom half of the spread. Be sure to look at your document from a more macro level too. And so by that I mean view your document in spreads as you're working to see how the final product will look to the reader. On the web, an example of this would be to not place a huge photo next to a small amount of text, unless the text size has been increased to take up more room. Otherwise, the photo would be overpowering. Tip number 4 is face images into the page. Now, for print and digital documents, typically on a cover, you want any images of people to face toward the opening of the book, like you're leading the reader into the book. And on the inside spreads, you usually want people to be facing inward toward the inner margins. On a web page, it's a bit different. For any photos that you have that are not full width and have text wrapping around them, it's usually best to place the photo so that the person or the people in it are facing toward the center of the page. For example, if you have a photo on the left with a person in it and then you have text to the right of it, the person should be looking toward the right, toward the text, and then vice versa. So if you have text on the left and a photo on the right, you want them to be facing toward the text. Now, sometimes to accomplish this, you have to flip the photo, and in some cases that's perfectly fine, but in other cases, such as if there's text in the image somewhere, you don't want it to read backwards. Tip number 5 is use sufficient space between sections. Having enough space between sections is important so that the reader can tell when one ends and another begins. So this means adding enough space before on your headings in your page layout program for print and digital documents. And then on the web, you want to have sufficient space between paragraphs as well. Typically, you want to have that be the height of a line to a line and a half after a paragraph. And this is something that's important for accessibility. And you would do this by adding margin in your CSS. So you would have space after paragraphs, and then you would have space before headings. Tip number 6 is add space between images and text. I sometimes see pages where body text is almost right up against a photo with a caption, making it hard to make out where the body text ends and the caption begins. So give your layout breathing room and add space between images and captions, and then between body text and images. For print and digital documents, in your page layout software, this is called text wrap. On the web, this would involve adding margin top, left, bottom, or right, or it might involve padding, depending on how the content is set up. Tip number 7 is use negative space. When you don't use enough negative space, also called white space, the content can feel overwhelming. Clients sometimes request filling up pages with content, but the more text that's crammed onto the page, the less likely someone is going to want to read it. But negative space can also be used strategically to draw attention to something on a page. Now let's get into some practices that pertain to typography. Now, I know from having a foreign language degree that some of these are used the same in other languages, but some are not. And I am only talking about these from a U.S. English standpoint. So that leads me to tip number 8, which is use correct typographic symbols. Typographic symbols convey certain meanings, so it really is important to get them right. And these are my pet peeve. I sometimes see the wrong type of quotation marks being used. Now, there are straight quotes, which are really foot and inch marks, and then there are curly quotes, also called typographer's quotes. These should be your default setting, the typographer's quotes, unless you type foot and inch marks more often than you do quotation marks. So if you need to change that, in your page layout program, go to your preferences and look for something called typographer's quotes and make sure that's checked. Another thing I often see is hyphens used instead of N or M dashes, but they all serve different purposes. In short, hyphens are for hyphenating words, and they're used in phone numbers. N dashes, on the other hand, are a bit longer than a hyphen, and they're used for numerical ranges. And there are other uses, but that's the main one. And then M dashes, the longest of the three, are used for a mid-sentence pause. So using them properly is going to make the content easier to understand. I also sometimes see 3 periods in succession, or a period space, period space, period space, being used instead of an ellipsis, which is used to show that part of a sentence, such as in a quote, was omitted. If you use 3 periods instead, what's going to happen, though, is that 1 or 2 of them may run over to the next line, and that's going to look sloppy. Now, if you aren't familiar with these symbols and you want more information, I highly recommend checking out episode 31, Touch Up Typographic Typos, and then downloading my free typography cheat sheet to help you out, and it's got all the keyboard shortcuts as well. Tip number 9 is remove extraneous spaces. Double spaces after a period should be removed. Adding 2 spaces after a period originated in the days of the typewriter. I know, I remember typing them on a typewriter. Modern typefaces, though, other than monospaced ones, already accommodate for the space after a period, so that makes it unnecessary practice to add 2 spaces. You might encounter copy that has been indented with spaces instead of tabs, too. If the text does need to be indented, do so with a paragraph style in your page layout software. If it's on a website, though, you can use CSS to indent it instead. And this will give you cleaner copy, and that is beneficial for 2 reasons. One is that it's more amenable to assistive devices or software that might be used by someone with a disability. And number 2 is that it's better for any content that might become an EPUB file. Tip number 10 is don't use too many typefaces. Like with candy, you can have too many typefaces. Using too many leaves the layout looking unprofessional and very distracting to the reader. A good rule of thumb is 2, maybe 3 for a project. Usually this is a serif typeface, a sans serif, and potentially a script or a handwritten one that you use sparingly. Now for print, typically it's best to use serif for body text, especially if it's long in length. But you can get away with sans serif too in some cases. Using a serif or a more decorative typeface for headings provides a really nice contrast. I've often used serif for body text and then sans serif for headings and sidebars, tables, charts, or infographics. Now for the web or a document being read on a screen, it's typical to use sans serif for body text. And then you could use sans serif, serif, or a decorative typeface for headings. When selecting the typeface, though, you really have to consider the audience. For instance, research shows that individuals with dyslexia find sans serif typefaces, such as Arial and Helvetica, easier to read than serif fonts. Tip number 11 is use proper sizes for text. The size of the text is important, and it might depend on the audience as well. For example, for an audience of senior citizens, you'll want to increase the size of the text. If you're using a script, handwritten, or other decorative typeface, you want to be sure to use it at a size large enough for it to be legible. These typefaces don't usually work well at smaller sizes, so they're best reserved for use in headings. Now, if you're specifying text size for the web, you should avoid setting the font size as an absolute measurement, like in pixels. This is vital for accessibility. So instead, you would stick with rems, ems, or percentages, which are relative units. And doing that makes it easier for someone using an assistive device or software to increase or decrease the font size as needed. Tip number 12 is use fonts that can be embedded. This is more so an issue with print and digital documents than it is for the web. I've seen designers post in groups and forums asking what to do after they tried to export their file for print or the web, and they get an alert saying that the fonts can't be embedded. Well, you could get around this by converting all the text to outlines. So yes, you could do that, but should you? No. You might actually be violating a licensing agreement, and that will render the text uneditable as well. So from the start, make sure you're using typefaces that are allowed to be embedded. A lot of the free fonts do not allow this, so always check that licensing. And if you need free fonts, just download Google Fonts. Most, if not all of them, are free to use for any purpose. And speaking of Google Fonts, when you use free open source fonts in your design work, it makes it easier to match them elsewhere, which is really good for branding. That means the client can also download those fonts and can use them for the documents that they produce. And then those same fonts can be used on their website too. So everything is cohesive. Of course, you and the client could both purchase typefaces, but not all clients are willing to do that. Tip number 13 is fully justify text only with hyphenation. In print, fully justified text is harder to read than flush left, rag right, unless you turn on hyphenation. Otherwise, what happens is you get gaps of varying widths between words, and these gaps are sometimes larger than the space between the lines, and that makes it harder to read and more difficult for your eye to track from the end of a line of text to the beginning of the next line of text. On the web, though, you want to avoid hyphenation altogether, as well as fully justified text, especially for long blocks of text. And this is also good practice for accessibility and overall usability. Tip number 14 is use sufficient leading. Leading is the term used for line spacing in print. Line height is the term for line spacing for the web in CSS. When there is too much or too little line spacing, it makes the text harder to read. Longer line lengths require more line spacing than shorter lines because it's more work for your eye to go from the end of a line to the start of the next one. A good rule of thumb, especially important for accessibility purposes, is to use about 1.5 lines worth of space, but this might be too little or too much depending on the typeface. You definitely want to make sure, though, that the second line of text in a heading is closer to its first line rather than to the first line of text in the paragraph after it. Also, sans serif typefaces usually require more leading than serif typefaces. Tip number 15 is avoid widows and orphans. This tip pertains to print and digital documents. Widows and orphans are short lines of text, a word or a word fragment that appear at the end of a paragraph and end up by themselves at the top of the next column or the next page, or ends up at the bottom of a column or page, continuing on to the next column or page. In InDesign, you can easily prevent most instances of these by going to the paragraph styles keep options and setting all your headings to keep lines together and then all lines in paragraph and keep with next 2 or 3 lines. So that'll keep all of your headings together. They won't split between pages or columns, and will make sure that those headings also stick with their next 2 or 3 lines of body text. For body text, you usually want this to be set to keep lines together, but at the start, end of paragraph with a 2 and a 2, and not keep with next lines. So what that means is you're keeping at least 2 lines together, or whatever you set, so you could have the 2 and the 2 refer to the start and the end of the paragraph text, and then not keeping with the next lines means it's not going to keep with whatever is after that. Now, if you want all of your paragraph text to never break across pages, then what you would do is to have it set to all lines in paragraph. You can also set hyphenation options to not break across columns and to not hyphenate the last word in a paragraph. And if you set these with no documents open, then these will always be in your styles. And there are ways that you can look for any remaining cases of these and then fix them with grep in InDesign. But for single words on a line by themselves, I just use a no-break character style, that's what I call it, and you can do that in InDesign or Affinity Publisher. And all that entails is checking off the no-break option inside the character style. I then apply that to the space before that word, along with the word itself. In Affinity Publisher, you can do this with the paragraph style's flow options and adjust the hyphenation options. You could also fix these issues with tracking, but I don't recommend going beyond like -15 or -20. Otherwise, the text gets scrunched, and then it gets hard to read, and it looks bad. Tip number 16 is don't format body text with a heading. I see this a lot on the web, and I see it in a lot of the InDesign files that I remediate for clients and other designers and creative firms for accessibility purposes. Don't style body text with a heading just because you want it to look that way. Instead, you want to style it with a custom style. Otherwise, what happens is the hierarchy of the page gets upset, and that affects search engine optimization, and it's really bad for accessibility too. That means that page might end up in search results where it shouldn't, which means people click through to the page and then they leave. Or it could mean that someone searching online doesn't encounter that page at all when they should have. Now, with accessibility, what happens is that anyone using an assistive device or assistive software can't understand the page content because the page structure is out of whack. Another potential issue is that it makes a mess when somebody goes to create an EPUB file. Like I said earlier, the cleaner the copy and the proper formatting, the better. Tip number 17 is don't indent text after a heading. Okay, this isn't awful, but it is a pet peeve of mine. Indenting the body text that immediately follows a heading. I actually always apply a style so that it does not indent these paragraphs. Tip number 18 is don't indent paragraphs that have space before them. Now, in general, you either indent paragraphs and use no space in between them, or you don't indent them and you do use a space between them, but not both. Okay, now I've got some color tips for you. Tip number 19 is don't use too many colors. Like too many typefaces, too many colors can be distracting. I recommend sticking with 2 main colors, possibly 3, with 1 or 2 accent colors that get used sparingly. Now, obviously, you may need more colors than this for data graphics or if you need to, signify different sections by color, and that's fine. Tip number 20 is use appropriate colors. I see designers all the time talking about how they choose colors based on their personal taste or what the client just wants. But the colors need to be appropriate for the brand. If a client's brand uses green and blue, for example, you don't want to use hot pink and black just because you like it or the client likes it. You also want to consider their audience and the demographics, such as gender and age. So fun, bright colors could work for a younger audience, and darker colors would work better for, say, a male audience. Tip number 21 is ensure sufficient contrast. I often see very light-colored text being used on a light background, or its counterpart, dark text against a dark background. It's hard for me to read, and I don't even have any vision issues. So don't make readers work to get information. And if you're following accessibility practices, which results in a better experience for all readers, then in every situation where you have a different color on a different background, you'll need to consider and you need to check the contrast against each other. So that means checking body text against its background, checking headings against their background, checking sidebar text against its background, and then link and button text against their backgrounds, and so forth. And that's whether it's a PDF or a web page. There are a lot of free online checkers that do this, by the way, and I really like the WebAIM color contrast checker. Now, when it comes to finishing up your document, I've got a couple tips for that. Tip number 22 is spell check. There's absolutely no excuse for not spell checking. Yeah, it might be the client's responsibility or their copy editor's responsibility, but if you spot errors and alert the client to them, then that makes you the hero. You're helping them save face and look more professional. You're looking out for them. I will say, though, that I do also point out errors to clients because once there was a word I didn't think was correct, and it was. And I'm Grammar Gratzer over here, and I have even done professional medical editing in the past, and I would have gotten that wrong. So I do always let them know, just in case. But another reason to let them know is in case they're planning to use that same copy elsewhere, so they can fix it on their end and make sure it's correct. Now, for print and digital documents, if you're using InDesign or Affinity Publisher, it's really easy to spell check as you do the layout work. And that's what I do. In InDesign, you would just check Enable Dynamic Spelling in the Preferences. And then in Affinity Publisher, you go to Text and then Spelling and check spelling while typing. Now, if you're working on something for the web and you're using WordPress, it will identify misspelled words too. Now, if you're not using that and what you're using doesn't do this, then you can copy and paste the text into another program that does. Tip number 23 is add bookmarks. So this one only applies to digital documents. You can easily add bookmarks by creating a table of contents based on certain styles. That's in your page layout software. And even if you're not going to have a table of contents in the document, you can just put it on the pasteboard. Just check the option to create PDF bookmarks. And then after you export to interactive PDF, just open the PDF and go to File, Properties, and then Initial View, and then under the Navigation tab, select Bookmarks Panel and Page. Otherwise, you can add them manually in InDesign or Affinity Publisher, but it's always best to put them in the page layout software because then if you ever have to update the file and export again, you don't have to do it all over again in Acrobat. Now, all of this might seem like a lot of work, but these details do get easier with experience and as they become part of your process. So what you can do is add them to a task list in your favorite project management software and just make sure that you check for these things as you're doing your page layout. And if you're a print designer, be sure to check out episode 3, Perfect Your Print Process. I talk all about proper file setup, folds, binding, paper, ink, coatings, fonts and images, and how to get print bids. If you use InDesign for page layout, don't miss episode 15, where Jason Hoppy of Creative Live and I discuss our favorite InDesign tips and ways to be much more efficient in InDesign. Even if you use Affinity Publisher, you can do most of these things as well. And if you're a web designer, you can find out more about accessibility on my website, creative-boost.com. Go to the podcast page and then the accessibility category. I've talked about accessibility in several episodes of this podcast. I've also given a webinar for WP Elevation, and I've been interviewed on several podcasts and websites about accessibility. And you can access all of that content right on that page. Also on my website, you can download my free typography cheat sheet, which you can find at creative-boost.com/freebies. And as always, links to all of these resources that I mentioned today are in the show notes. Do you want to get more respect and command higher rates? I can help you go from order taker to expert through mentoring, my free guides, and premium resources such as my brand style guide builder and my website accessibility course. You can find out more at creative-boost.com. You can also join me and other creatives in the Design Domination Facebook group.